no one in Black Africa invented writing.
This video from Jared Taylor has gone viral on Twitter and on TikTok.
Black Africans never built anything remotely like this.
But how true are these claims?
Go to any art museum and look at the African section. It's right across the hall from pieces like this.
It makes assertions that are pretty inflammatory, assertions that we will review point by point. In his tirade, Jared Taylor tries to imply that Africans did not have any signs of civilization prior to the arrival of Europeans and Arabs. And by extension, he tries to argue that Africans were less intelligent. You will find many self-proclaimed messiahs boasting assertions about black people. While I debated, including his statements in this video, it is important to address them head-on so that next time they prop up, we have the tools to address them. So let's break it down. His first argument is that black people did not invent the wheel. Second, he boasts that there were no two-story buildings made by black people. And third, that black people had not domesticated any animals. Fourth, no one in Africa invented writing. Number 5, he argues that there was no sign of civilization south of the Sahara, and thus by extension people did not create any civilization at all. So all we have to do is to try and find just one of these signs in any black history. Because following his logic, it would be impossible for blacks to have any of these signs since Africans do not carry the hallmarks of intelligence. Well then, throughout this video, I will use research papers to demonstrate the fallacies of these arguments. And as I do, I would like you to take notes, because one day you will be confronted with somebody who has watched his video, or videos just like this one, and you will need to be equipped with knowledge to dismantle the irrational arguments being brought forth, and if not for yourself, at least for the people surrounding you that you love, or for the next generation. And how many of these research papers and books do we cite that show that Africans not only had civilizations, but in fact are the very group that kick-started civilization and shared it to all the other people while they were still in the Stone Age? How many do you think there were? 42. I have compiled 42 irrefutable evidence for you to counteract this. Not just one, because one would have been enough to counter his points, but we have 42. And I only chose 42 because of the significance of this number, because I could not include the mountains and mountains of other research papers that also confirm the same thing. That from the inventors of agriculture to the inventors of writing. That from the invention of mathematics and algebra to the invention of medicine. That from the invention of architecture to astronomy and religion. All these inventions were made by black Africans. They did not come from Europe. They did not come from Asia or the New World, but they came from Africa and fanned out to the rest of the world. In fact, to date, all writing systems ever used are derived from the black African writing system, including Arabic, Greek, Phoenician, Latin, Chinese, and Olmec. They are all clear direct derivatives of this African invention. In sum, the exact opposite of what Jared Taylor is saying, and if you do not learn the facts, you will be forever doomed to be psychologically bullied by those who come with weak arguments from the 18th century failed Eurocentric archaeological attacks against the black man, an attack initiated to ensure that they could justify the mistreatment of their fellow man for economic reasons, a deception that has now been incorporated into history books as if it was gospel, and ingested by a generation that does not have the time to research the truth. Fabrications that were protected and maintained by the very authority that we are supposed to trust on this matter. An authority whose members, in almost complete totality, an authority that cowered behind this lie and that is still afraid to speak the truth. This lie has now ballooned into a movement that uses this very lie to justify atrocities against a whole segment of our population, even if it hurts them too, and where Jared Taylor tries to argue that Haiti is poor because it is controlled by blacks, I will remind him that Haiti was doing very well economically until the US and France decided to decimate Haiti economically, something they have never done to Germany, where they poured billions and even went to build. In fact, Haiti was doing so good, they couldn't let it succeed. But I am getting ahead of myself. We know how the game is being played now. We know how destruction and destabilization has been going on for decades in black-controlled countries, just so that they could, number 1, continue exploitation, and number 2, maintain that very lie that Jared is touting. So we will start deconstructing this lie by the first and oldest civilization, the first one to have agriculture and build monuments, the ones that built the great site of Göbekli Tepe. Now, whether or not there was a great civilization before or during the Ice Age that got wiped out at the end of the Younger Dryas, that I will leave for another video. Around 10,000 BC, humans faced a critical turning point. The Younger Dryas, around 13,000 BC, caused a sudden drop in temperatures, followed by a rapid rise 11,500 years ago. This warming led to rising sea levels and the disappearance of large land animals. Catastrophic flooding deposited fertile soil in the Near East, paving the way for agriculture, which sparked population growth and technological advances. Researchers from the University of Michigan confirmed in a 2005 paper that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Linguistic analysis also shows Natufian language closely resembles the Niger-Congo family, indicating that the Natufians were an advanced Black African culture. Genetic tests by Dr. Iosef Lizaridis and Dr. Nadine Rowland from Harvard found that Natufians had clear African DNA markers without Neanderthal admixture. Furthermore, Dr. Gil Hackley and Dr. Avi Gopher, in their 2015 paper, demonstrated that the Natufians were building temples with advanced architectural planning, likely contributing to the construction of Göbekli Tepe. Dr. Dorothy Garrett also attests that the Natufians, who lived in the Middle East since 13,000 BC, were behind this monumental achievement. Sir Arthur described the Natufians as a Negroid people with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads, as noted in a New York Times publication. Skeletal remains detailed in Paleopathology and the Origins of Agriculture by Mark Nathan Cohen and George G. Amalagas show that Natufians were of medium stature with dolichocephalic skulls, broad short faces, and a tendency towards prognathism, traits characteristic of African populations. So they have African craniums, they have African Niger-Congo language, and they have African genetics. Remember that, because many will put statements like, the Natufians were from the Middle East without specifying the period. And this is misleading, because the Middle East in that period of time had a vastly different population that was black and that didn't have any Neanderthal admixture. So let's pause here for our friend Jared Taylor, who claimed that Africans didn't have any signs of civilization. Well, our Natufians, who speak a Niger-Congo language and have black African phenotype and genes, literally created the first known megalithic superstructure in history, one that has themes and relics that appear in multiple other subsequent civilizations. And if Göbekli Tepe is any indication, the Natufians were very sophisticated. In Göbekli Tepe and in other monuments, they show that they had knowledge of so many sciences. Mathematics, architecture, astronomy, just to name a few. In fact, all this information adds up because we already know that Africans were performing advanced mathematics 25,000 years ago with the Ashango bone. Yet another fact that Jared Taylor conveniently forgot. The bone shows mastery of prime numbers, multiplications, division, and even relationships between prime numbers, relationships that we just rediscovered and understood recently. And guess where the Ashango bone was found? You guessed it, in the Niger-Congo area, which matches the language spoken by the Natufians. They were also performing burial practices similar to the ones found in ancient Egypt. They were so sophisticated that they performed a very early version of mummification for their dogs that they buried with them in their tombs. So, just with the Natufians alone, we could counter all of Jared Taylor's points. But you have to ask yourself, why is it that the true ethnicity of the Natufians isn't publicized? Well, it would immediately erase any arguments that people like Jared have. In fact, the Natufians weren't even as advanced as the next black civilizations whose ethnicities were also denied for years, until genetic studies proved them as purely African. Armed with agriculture, mathematics, and stone-building skills, the Natufians significantly influenced the world, beginning with Egypt. By 8000 BC, the people of ancient Egypt, known as Kemet, constructed Nabta Playa, an advanced celestial observatory aligned with the stars, showcasing African sophistication long before Sumerian civilization emerged. A few millennia later, they invented writing, one of humanity's most pivotal achievements. Dr. Günther Dreyer of the German Archaeological Institute demonstrated that the Africans of Kemet were the first to use writing, predating the Sumerians. They also constructed some of the most enduring stone monuments of ancient times, and aside from the pyramids and the Sphinx, who are already impressive enough, one of the most enigmatic and complex structures ever built is the Osirion, which is found below the Temple of Seti I. This temple has unbelievable dimensions and properties. This is an underground complex, with a 15-meter moat and a hollow center island. Just to be clear, there were no such comparable monuments anywhere on Earth when the Osirion and the pyramids were built. Nothing even close. In fact, even old monuments that we find from that period pale in comparison to what was built in ancient Egypt and Nubia. So then, what does actual research, including genetic research, say about the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians? In her research paper, Dr. Katrin Bard attests to the origin of complex society in Kemet from the south. In fact, Dr. David Okonor goes further and complements that argument with his own research on prehistoric Kemet between 5000 and 3000 BC was not very different in its nature from that of contemporary African cultures. Add to this the studies that show that pre-dynastic Egyptians had L0F genetic markers showing they originated from Central Africa, and the numerous genetic studies showing that the most predominant haplogroup in ancient Egypt is the E1b1a, also called M2, which is most prevalent in black Africans from West and Central Africa. This is in line with the multitude of ancient Egyptians' artifacts and contemporary pharaoh statues showing them as unmistakably black African. And they would continue the megalithic culture that they had initiated in the Levant 4,000 years before, and would perfect it to such a scale that it took until the end of the 19th century for a man-made structure to rival it in height. So Jared, how is it that a civilization that is black African well before the arrival of the Arabs in 800 AD, a civilization that is considered the greatest civilization in human history, that pretty much invented all the hallmarks that were inherited by the Greeks, the Romans, and the Arabs, how is it that this black civilization didn't make it in your lexicon? I know why. It is precisely because it is so inconvenient for your ill-informed arguments to show the scientific evidence of a black ancient Egypt Kemet that we see so many attacks and lies. It is precisely because of that that people like Jared have conveniently forgotten all the testimonies of the Greeks and Romans, who were contemporaries to the ancient Egyptians, and who described them as pure black Africans. The irony of this is not lost on us, and it exposes the true intentions of those who think like Jared, and it is that in order to justify their hatred, and in order to justify all the mistreatment and misfavoritism that the black man and the black woman has endured, in order to make any of that okay, it was required to dehumanize the people of African descent. And unfortunately for Jared, it isn't just the Natufians and the Egyptians that were black, smart, and advanced beyond anything they could imagine. The blacks also developed civilization in the western part of Africa, when it was still lush and green. The ancient Egyptians myth that the Greeks relate to us as the story of Atlantis tells us that there was a grandiose civilization that got wiped out 12,000 years ago, and that they migrated to ancient Egypt to restart their civilization. Here is one of the hundreds of studies that shows that Central Africans migrated 9,000 years ago to the ancient Sahara, and then migrated to Egypt. So before the Kemetu, that we call the ancient Egyptians before them, while the Sahara was still green, there was a large and grandiose civilization that existed throughout the Sahara. To get a sense of how big this African civilization was, we have to realize that the distance between Moscow in Europe and Beijing, China, are identical. 5,800 kilometers or 3,600 miles. Yes, this will not translate on the map, because maps have been distorted to represent Africa as much smaller than it is. But it means that this civilization that existed there was one of the largest in human history, and they were very complex. Multiple splendid but little-known megalithic ruins have been found in the Sahara Desert. So it was far larger than Greece, far larger than Rome, and far larger than the Ottoman Empire. And even after the drying up of the Sahara, which caused the slow demise of this civilization, the ancient Egyptians continued to trade with them, and they described them as identical to themselves. You guessed it, black African. Researcher Babacar Sall states that, quote, Ancient Sahara, the one before the desert, reaffirms its ethnic and cultural origins as black African. End quote. So, as we cover these periods of time from 10,000 BC to 3000 BC, you will notice that both the fauna and flora of Africa and the Middle East was very different from what we have today. We had a hot and humid environment where tropical features were required to survive and thrive, and that is exactly what we see in the genetic record of the people living there. Black African genotype and phenotype. So considering this, how on earth can Jared Taylor even begin to assert the absurdities that he relates in his video? And it goes beyond the classical civilizations who were located on the continent of Africa. There is another civilization whose ethnic origin has been so denied that it has also been used as fuel by ill-intentioned people like Jared Taylor. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, the building of ziggurats, the Sumerians were accomplished mathematicians, astronomers, and credited with the invention of the wheel and our method of timekeeping. But Sumer is often wrongly assigned the title of the first civilization. It is not even close. Egypt Kemet is much older. The hope was that if they could keep stating that Sumer was the beginning of civilization and then prove that Sumer was a Caucasian or Semitic civilization, that the problem would be solved. Well, let's look at what the scientific data actually says. In his book, Black Sumer, The Physical Evidence, author Hermann Hermstein shows that remains found in early Mesopotamian burial sites were unmistakably black. This is perfectly illustrated in the victory stele of Naram Sin, where both Naram Sin himself and the people of Zagreb that he defeated are phenotypically black with full complement of afros, luscious lips, and long limbs. Furthermore, in 2009, researchers from the Department of Anthropology of the University of Florida discovered that the Semitic language has its roots in ancient African languages, and I quote, "These results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Near East, no earlier than approximately 7,400 YBP, after having diverged from Afro-Asiatic in Africa." End quote. So again, the early Sumerians, the true creators of that civilization, had black phenotype. They had an African language, and they referred to themselves as Salmat Kakadi, or black-headed people. Something you will not hear Jared Taylor and his followers mention. The misrepresentation of Sumerians as Europeans or Arabs is perpetuated by showcasing artifacts from the Guchian rule of Lagash as indicative of the true progenitors of Sumerian civilization, despite no recognition of Guchian rulers in the Sumerian king list. And this is where it gets interesting, if not ironic. Because if we listen to Jared, we would think that Africans had nothing historically because they were incapable. Well, in this next section, we will see how it is, in fact, black Africans that went on to spread knowledge and technology to the rest of the still primitive world at the time. While most are familiar with the Greeks and Romans, fewer know of the earlier civilizations like the Pelasgians and Etruscans, or their origins. The Greeks, credited with philosophy, democracy, and the arts, themselves acknowledged that their knowledge and civilization were rooted in the African culture of Kemet. The Pelasgians, whom the Greeks recognized as the founders of their civilization, were said to originate from the Black Earth, a term also used for Kemet. African influence continued in Greece for millennia, shaping their religion, art, and even genetics. Dr. Arnaiz Vilena's 2001 research shows that the Greeks have significant genetic links to sub-Saharan Africans, even 4,000 years after their colonization. This doesn't mean the Greeks were black, but the African presence was substantial, as seen in Minoan frescoes and other artifacts. The Romans are famous for their paved roads and for the origin of the Western alphabet, but this innovation actually began in Kemet, ancient Egypt, passed to the Greeks, and then to the black Etruscans, who in turn taught the Romans. The Etruscans, a highly advanced civilization, laid the foundation for Rome's religion, art, architecture, and engineering, including roads, aqueducts, and drainage systems. The Roman alphabet is also rooted in the Etruscan one. According to Gert Muller's Black Origins of Ancient Rome, the Etruscans were dark-skinned descendants of ancient Egypt, who brought their advanced culture and technology to what became Roman territory. They worshipped the Egyptian sun god Ra and built tombs resembling those in Egypt. Is it not strange that the very people who are so demonized, so hated, so vilified and called backwards, is it not strange that it is these very people to whom we owe civilization itself? And not from my mouth, but from the mouth of the ancestors of current-day Europeans themselves. From Plato to Democritus to Pythagoras to Herodotus to Solon, they all said the same thing, that Greece owes everything to Africa, and in fact they all went to study in Africa, all of them. Let that sink in. All these Greek writers that we study today got their education in Africa before they started to write their theses, and after having learned everything they can from the black African priests from Kemet. I didn't hear Jared Taylor mention any of this in his tirade, but by now you are beginning to see the pattern of his thinking, and you are starting to realize that he is either completely ignorant or that he has malicious intent, and in either one of these cases he should not be a leader of any group. And I hope that you have been taking notes, because you are going to need those notes when we quiz you on our Patreon group to make sure you are ready to respond to false allegations like these ones. This African civilization also expanded eastwards. But before we get to China and Japan, there are a few more civilizations that were started by this gargantuan African civilization, which started in 10,000 BC. The first of which is yet another civilization that was clearly black, but never mentioned as so. We owe them our alphabet. They were said to be amongst the best navigators of the ancient world, but they are best known to be the parent culture of the Carthaginians. The Phoenicians were clearly another colony of the ancient African civilization. Before the invasion of the Persians in 539 BC, Phoenicia was predominantly black. In the centuries that preceded that invasion, the black people from Kemet settled in the Levant area and brought with them all the elements of their civilization, from writing to religion. These newcomers would have mixed with the black Natufian stock and the black Sumerian stock. Remember, the victory stele of Naram Sin depicts the king and the people he conquered as black Africans. And this can be seen in all the Phoenicians' outposts, like this one in Gades, Spain, where the heads of the Phoenicians' colonists have been found depicted in these beautiful carvings that are unmistakably African. But we can also see it in the Phoenician alphabet, which is a carbon copy of Hieratic, the more popular version of hieroglyphics, the ancient Egyptian writing system. Surely if we ask Jared Taylor, he would say that these early Phoenicians depicted here are servants. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. We also see it in their religion. Even early Phoenician deities like Baal are depicted as black ancient Egyptians with pharaonic poses. So the black Phoenicians had already settled most of their Mediterranean colonies by the time the Persian invaded in 500 BC. And one of those colonies was the famous naval power that almost toppled Rome. As we have already seen, studies show that prehistoric North Africa was predominantly inhabited by people who would be considered black Africans today. So it should come as no surprise that excavations in ancient Carthage reveal that the elite, including a high priestess of Tani, were almost exclusively black. Professor Eugene Pittard remarked, quote, "The woman buried there had Negro features. She belonged to the African race." End quote. This is supported by Professor Stéphane Gussel, who noted, quote, "The so-called Semitic type has not yet been found in Carthage." End quote. Carthage, founded by Phoenicians near modern-day Tunis, had a population with significant African ancestry. French historian Gabriel Audicio, in his 1961 work, stated that Hannibal was a North African. The majority of the Punic populace seems to have had African, indeed Negroid, ancestry, indicating a mix of ancient Nubian and Aboriginal North African heritage. So then, Jared and his crew might ask, why is it that the Carthaginian illustration that we see online always depict white people and not even Asiatics, let alone black Africans, as the research shows that they were? Well, it is important to take into context the following facts. The majority of those depictions were made centuries after Carthage had ended as a civilization. Furthermore, those who did these illustrations were themselves European. It is only natural that they would paint this most successful of generals to their image. Lastly, those depictions of Hannibal that clearly show him as phenotypically black African are seldom, if ever, shared in history, documentaries, and books. And yet, when you look at the coins of Hannibal minted in Italy, this is what you see. As the great ancient African civilization spread eastwards, they started showing up as deities all over Asia. And this influence from the black Africans who started in the Niger-Congo basin, migrated to Egypt and Sumer, this influence is also found in Asia, where kanji, the Chinese writing system, has been proven to be a direct descendant of hieroglyphics, and where black Buddhas are still venerated all over Asia. Black Buddhas in Nepal, black Buddhas in Myanmar, black Buddhas in India, black Buddhas in Bangladesh, black Buddhas in Thailand, black Buddhas in Vietnam. And this influence is also found on the other side of the globe in the Americas, where the Olmecs, the mother culture of all following Mesoamerican cultures, has been shown to have been started by none other than the Africans. We can see that in the black Olmec heads. We can see that in their writing, which is a direct descendant of hieroglyphics too, even down to their burial practices and social hierarchies. What about all the countries south of the Sahara? Was there any sign of civilization there before the arrival of the Europeans and the Arabs? To understand what happened there, we must first understand two key factors: construction materials and systematic erasure of African monuments. Throughout Black Africa, from Nubia to South Africa, black people chose the most effective and the most environmentally friendly way of building. They built predominantly using mud bricks, the same type used in the widely celebrated Mohenjo-Daro, which means that although these constructions lasted for a few centuries, they were also prone to destruction, which is exactly what happened during colonialism. Again, in an effort to maintain the perception of the black man as less evolved, they had to ensure that no palaces, no monuments, and no writings survived. They had to erase the memory of the black man and the black woman's history, so they set out to pillage and burn it all. Luxurious palaces, such as the one from the King of Benin, burned to ashes, although eyewitnesses said it to be more beautiful than the palace of the Queen of England. Or the Great Wall of Benin, the defensive wall that protected the city, and that was much longer than the Great Wall of China, also destroyed by the British. Same thing goes for the magnificent monuments found by early colonists in northern Ivory Coast, burned to the ground. And where stone was used, like in Great Zimbabwe, the colonists try to argue that this was built by a white race that came to the area. And like many of the lies made about Africa and black people, it has stuck, and most have incorporated the lie into their knowledge, but are not aware of the African achievements there. By the way, the Dutch and British colonists who explored Great Zimbabwe undertook to burn an untold number of relics and made sure to hide any signs of writing. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe have been damaged over the last 2 centuries, not least due to the British journalist Richard Nicklin Hall, who in 1902 was appointed curator of Great Zimbabwe by the British South Africa Company for the purposes not of scientific research, but the preservation of the building. Hall destroyed a significant part of the site, claiming he was removing signs of the African occupation. In his search for signs that the city had been created by white builders, layers of archaeological deposits up to 13 feet or 4 meters deep were lost. Or even the magnificent tall pyramid from the Kingdom of Benin, it too destroyed by the British. We are lucky to have a surviving picture of it, although it is from too far away. Even the stone circles in Senegambia, older and more numerous than Stonehenge, and yet these are not publicized. What about the Nok culture in Nigeria? Nok culture is said to have migrated from the Central Sahara region to settle in the current Nigeria in 1500 BC, and as we saw from research shared by Kamjiversi, this is not surprising. Nook culture proves that the early ancient African civilization had achieved a very high level of sophistication. When you admire their sculpture, you get a sense of the complexity of their society. Sir Ralph Moore, British Consul General for the Bight of Benin and Biafra, stated, "The appearance of the city as we approached it was very imposing. The walls of the king's palace, the numerous buildings, and the tall palm trees presented a picture of civilization and magnificence which were little expected in the heart of Africa." End quote. And yet, it was only one of many. From the superb pre-colonial architecture of the Ashanti, along with its multitude of similarities with Kemet from the Ankh to the Scepter, to the Mali Empire, to the now lost palaces in northern Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, to the beautiful stone structures in Niger. All over West Africa, the architecture of the descendants of the Natufio-Saharan Kemetic civilization kept rebuilding wherever they could, one civilization as beautiful as the next. But also in the Empire of Congo, with its gargantuan medieval civilization and its superb metalworks. Some of these cities had been painted by early colonists before they were destroyed. And yes, pretty much all of them had multi-story buildings. The real shame of it all is that, centuries after the 18th century plan to keep the African back by lying about his and her achievements and thus our potential, 300 years on, this charade has now transformed into a condition believed by both the descendants of the oppressor and the descendants of the oppressed, and this to devastating effects and outcomes. Because as experiments have shown, if you can psychologically boost yourself to success, you can definitely pin yourself to failure. The objective of this heist was to keep the African behind so that the colonists could benefit. But this has now transformed into a reality where the effect is mistaken for the cause, and where institutionalized disfavor towards those of African descent has caused them to remain poor, not just in the Americas but also in Africa, where maintaining the African in economic strife was necessary to continue pillaging the continent of its resources. Yet it was the African that started civilization. A civilization so large that it went from the most western point of Africa when it was still green all the way to the Levant, that we call today the Near East, a location that is arguably well within the historical geographical bounds of Africa. These deniers are now faced with the dilemma that those who they have taught themselves to hate the most happen to be those to whom they own all the tools of civilization, from math to agriculture and astronomy, even as far as their vocabulary, and that lie has taken such height that they went so far as to try and suppress, and in many cases erase, all evidence of the black man in history. And if their argument was true, then there wouldn't be even one. There would be absolutely no instance of black civilization anywhere in the world, and guess how many we cited today alone? 42. 42 civilizations that were or that were started by black African. Surely by now you have subscribed and clicked the like button. If you haven't yet, then at least leave a comment. Along with the many who have supported the channel financially, your positive comments are what helps me continue. To my Patreon supporters, YouTube members, crypto donors, and anyone who has clicked the like button, you guys are the Knights of Enlightenment. You all deserve the title of Initiates, the High Priest of Aswan, Protectors of the Oba, Great Griots to the Mansa, Counselors of Shaka, Priest of the Ethiopian Churches, Cavalry of the Almoravid Kings, Sword of the King of the Congo Empire, Advisors to the King in Goya, Third Ring of the King of Atlantis, Golden Stool of Azantwa. I salute you all.